You said that your original association with Zelig Harris was in the area of radical politics. You are identified with the New Left, whatever that is. You certainly have been an activist as well as a writer and anti-war, anti-Vietnam War. And you've said that the course of history may be determined to a very significant degree by what the people of the United States will have learned from the catastrophe, meaning, of course, the Vietnam War. What, in your opinion, have we learned from this experience?
I would say very little, unfortunately. At the time I wrote that, which I guess was 7 or 8 years ago, what I had in mind was that there are really two different ways of looking at this catastrophe. One can look at it as a failed venture, a mistake, something which was...
It was a mistake because it failed.
A mistake because it failed, but perfectly all right if it succeeded. And I think it's probably fair to say that at least among intellectuals, people who write and speak publicly...
You've been rather harsh on the intellectuals.
Yeah, I think they're totally unprincipled on this. I mean, I think the dominant view is that if we had gotten away with it, it would have been all right, but we couldn't get away with it, so therefore it was stupid, and therefore we should get out. You know, worse than a crime, it was a blunder or something of that sort. Now, if that's all that's learned from it, I think it'll have no effect on future history. It will have shown that there are limits to American imperialism.
And your opposition has been on moral grounds, that it was wrong from the outset, although you said your opposition came 15 years too late.
Well, active opposition came 15 years too late. I think the time for active opposition should have been about 1950 or a little later. But I didn't become really actively engaged in opposing the war until about 1964 or 65. And at that point, the United States was very deeply involved in what, if we were honest, we would call aggression against South Vietnam. That's in fact what it was. But I had, of course, always been opposed to the war. In fact, I was opposed to the Korean War, and it may surprise you, but I was even skeptical about the Second World War.
Are you a pacifist?
No, not a pacifist.
Are there justifications for war under certain circumstances?
Yeah, I can see justifications for a defensive war. I could, putting it all together, I think there are justifications for a war against Nazi Germany in the 40s. But I felt, I was a high school student at the time, but felt then, and have continued to feel, and in fact wrote about it in this book, that a good deal of the alleged justification for the war was totally beside the point, and that we were engaged in the war for reasons other than opposition to fascism or concern for people being sent to gas chambers and things of that kind. In fact, those motivations, I think, were virtually non-existent. Nevertheless, despite the hypocrisy, and there was plenty, I think that war could be justified. And I'm not a pacifist in the sense of someone who believes that it is in principle wrong ever and always to undertake violent acts. I think you have to have a strong reason for it, very strong. The burden of proof is certainly on a person who wants to undertake the use of means of violence, but I believe occasionally that burden can be met.
The way in which you describe the Vietnam War, particularly in your own words, is such that one would think that any good American, I use it in quotation marks, would totally reject the support of the Vietnam War. It's in your words, it stands for all that we're opposed to, oppression of other peoples and so forth. Now, either you would be wrong in your description, or there has to be a reason why the American would accept a war of this sort. Which is it? I guess you would never say it was a wrong description, of course. It's a stupid question from that point.
First of all, I'm not sure. See, we don't know what the population as a whole accepts or rejects because they're inarticulate largely. Among the people who are articulate, intellectuals, people who speak and write articles and so on, I think they've made it overwhelmingly clear that they consider the question of right or wrong irrelevant in the case of the United States. Of course, it's relevant if we're talking about some other country. For example, everyone would agree that it was wrong for the Russians to invade Czechoslovakia. That is, no one says, well, it was okay because they got away with it. But those criteria are never applied to ourselves, and that is totally unprincipled, though typical of other societies act this way as well. And it's that kind of lack of principle that I think has to be overcome, and the ideology behind it.
Being able to see ourselves as others see us, or as we see others, I suppose.
See ourselves by the principles that we occasionally enunciate. Apply those to ourselves. Yes.
I want to ask you in 30 seconds whether, if we do, in fact, by pursuing or expanding upon your studies, learn more about man's intelligence and how it functions, will that contribute to a better life?
It may contribute to a better understanding of what the essential needs of human beings are, and from that it's conceivable that someday we'll grow a concept of a how a decent society ought to be organized, I think.
Thank you very much.